This is week 3 of the cost of discipleship. Dun, dun, dun. All right, we're going to dive into it. If you didn't gather, I'm assuming everyone read most of it, or at least skimmed it, or looked at least read the first paragraph. If you read the first and last paragraph of any chapter, you'll get pretty much what it's about, and you can skip the rest. It's not as enriching, but it'll get you through a few degrees.
2 hours yesterday, and I could have done it in 5 minutes.
Yeah, you could have, but I
and
mean,
then you can sleep well.
but then you don't. But that's only when you have to. Yeah. So we're going to go through this. One of the chapters was from last week. So you probably, if you're reading by the schedule, you would have read it last Tuesday. So it was a while ago, and then there was no reading on Wednesday. We carried on. But what we're getting from the Beatitudes down to revenge is the first part of the sermon on, or really the Sermon on the Mount. And he goes through three chapters in Matthew. And a couple things that we both, and I said this in the sermons, but we need to remember here too, is one, Matthew was written to Jews. That's just, so in the rhetoric around old law, new law, and the stuff that he goes into law, that is so foreign to us that we just can't understand that because we don't operate in that way. So one, Matthew was written to speak to Jews and the issues that they were dealing with. And then Bonhoeffer, again, was writing this in a very challenging time and was going, everything he says in these things are extremes. Although I will say, I do think in Revenge, he backpedaled a little. You can almost see, and I don't remember, I'm not a Bonhoeffer scholar, but I don't remember when the seeds of the assassination that Bonhoeffer was a part of a plot to assassinate Hitler, and he called it spoke in the wheel, or if you grabbed the wheel from a madman, if he's going to kill all these people, then you're doing, as if there was some end justifies the means. And this is what makes Bonhoeffer actually as a historical and theological figure so fascinating to explore just ethically, because he goes through this whole thing and it's like rigid, legalistic, denying, unflinching adherence to this extreme of the gospel. But yeah, when he gets to the revenge, you can see a little bit of a seed of, well, there's maybe, surely Jesus considers the world that we live in. And so it does, and I don't, and I'm just sort of, that was just what hit me as I read that today.
Uh-oh. It was the late 43, because Hitler got even more paranoid about his senior. So I think it was a little later in that.
In the chapter on revenge, like there's seeding of that. So if you were to go back and look at his writings and analyze them for seeds of a ethical justification that somehow assassination of a madman is okay, it wasn't we'll talk about it.
I feel like I see a similar wrestling in the oaths chapter. It's not like it's absolutely no oath and that's final. It's like it's pretty much final, but obviously, like Paul swore oaths before the Roman court, and Jesus probably swore an oath in court also.
Yeah.
So
I think he swore an oath.
Yeah.
Somebody.
Well, there was a justification of that whole section in particular, which I do think is relevant in terms of the oath, because when we were preaching on it, that was the part where I was like, oh, well, we don't really do oaths in the same way. The most equivalent thing we have is standing in court with your hand on the Bible saying, we're taking an oath like you would as a judge or a city official. You put your hand on the Bible, and it's there to add a sense of magnitude. But I do like, and we'll get into it, that way he deals with the idea that the need for an oath is because deception exists.
and I guess what I was saying is I see like wrestling with other concepts, not just the revenge or like a justification for assassination.
Well, he wrote a whole book on ethics, so if you're very interested, you're welcome to borrow it. But he's a complicated ethicist.
It's light reading.
Light reading.
One correction I would make: they don't use the Bible in swearing in courts.
They don't?
It's no, I swear or affirm.
No, they don't do that
They don't do
anymore.
that. Bible is. no,
Maybe just here in godless Colorado.
Well, because they don't believe in what they come to find out, they don't believe in the Bible.
Hello, we can't hear you. You're
They
froze.
need-
Frozen, turned it, oh, my face. I'll move back and get the picture.
Is it unfrozen? I don't know what the deal is.
You guys are frozen.
It comes and goes.
Still?
Yeah,
Still, is it still frozen?
no,
No,
not
no,
now.
you're not, but it comes in and out.
When I turn it to everyone else, it freezes.
You're frozen now.
Let's see it. Let's just try. Does- Is it frozen now?
Yeah, it froze.
Yeah, okay. Apparently, when I turn it to them, it freezes. So you're just gonna have to look at my mug for the rest of this time. So. Oh, well, let's go through this because he is going through the scriptures as they are written and dealing with them as, although I do think he moves a few things out of order, but he let's go through this. So he starts with, let's start with chapter 6, the Beatitudes. And again, I did not preach on this individually. We did do a Bible study on them over the summer. So if you're interested, that's on the YouTube page. But let's turn to chapter 6 and flip through. And what stood out to you? Where did you put a star? What did you underline and circle?
Jason,
Yeah.
what did he mean by the Beatitudes are only for the disciples?
Yeah. So he essentially was saying that those who would have followed Jesus as around to the mount. In other words, we have this vision of like this big gigantic crowd out of them, but keep in mind there was no mic, so at some point your voice is going to only project so far. So probably a field more the size, even the side of a mountain, just sort of on a hill standing up. And there would have been people there probably extending out, and there would have been wives and children, but those would have been followers, would have been considered probably disciples in that regard. In other words, he's confining it to these stipulations apply more to those who you are in communion with and who claim to be disciples, about mediating some of the interactions between one another, as opposed to towards the end, I don't remember which one, he starts to say, the secular world, or how this applies to the beyond the Christian community. And so this, and not that the ethics in that wouldn't necessarily apply, but his concern is more with the Christian community in the way we behave, because the ultimate concern is how do we live our lives as disciples? So what claim does it make on us as a community first and foremost? Which I would say, I don't necessarily know that I would say that's the case, and I haven't really looked at it from that perspective about the Beatitudes or the Sermon on the Mount. I do think, though, like at the Last Supper, when Christ is washing feet and saying you love one another, he was talking to the disciples about their relationship with one another. So there is rhetoric towards his disciples in his inner circle. There's communication to disciples who the larger people who are cruising around following for a while. And then there's the general, does this apply to all disciples, which in most cases it does, but not always. Not to mention, remember that Matthew in Greek has a relationship to the word disciple or follower or learner. So the question was Matthew actually the author of it, or was Matthew sort of like the inscription to say for the disciple, for the learner, for the follower? That helpful?
When he had a crowd like that, would there have been critics and Pharisees and Sadducees and others
Early on,
followed
there
along?
early on, there would have probably been some Pharisees and Sadducees who were there who might have just been like curious. But when and Matthew gives a fuller account of the Beatitudes in the Sermon on the Mount, it goes through more Beatitudes. It goes through a little bit fuller explanation. But I think the other one is found in Luke, and Luke offers shorter Beatitudes, and it talks about him going into I don't know what the term is, the low places. And that doesn't necessarily mean like the low in the sense of just geographically low. It's meant to be like the impoverished places. So when I hear this text, I see him speaking to like, on the outskirts of community, not the leper community per se, but those who were already in a downtrodden space, because he was bringing hope. And in the face of those Pharisees and Sadducees and scribes who would have been on the fringe of that, it would have been a slap in their face, which he does engage them. But so they probably were there, now that I think about it. So, okay. What else in in chapter 6?
I just thought the Beatitudes were more of a promise of rewards for those who follow, as compared to the 10 Commandments, which were punishment for the various things that, thou shalt not do.
Yeah.
And so it was a twist. It was, one was don't do it, and the other, blessed are.
Yeah. No, yeah. And I think that he goes back a little bit into that law, in that sense of when the law was given, it was there to guide and I think maybe that's where it taps into the idea, was he speaking to the disciples? The law that is given by Moses and all of the Levitical laws that come out of that were for the functioning and flourishing of the community. And therefore, what Jesus is doing is taking the essence of saying at a time where those laws were needed to keep everyone in line. And so, as I was reading, I was thinking, it must have just been like just a big, gigantic scene of debauchery, because no one had any moral ethics. It would have been like, what's yours is mine. And so there wasn't a sense of, and so the fact that there are so many 10 commandments about the respect of someone else's property says to me the converse was that there was a lot of disrespect of property going on before that. I always like to look at, what we were cursed to do this. What was the reverse of the curse, or the opposite of that curse on the other side? So in the case of the law, these laws and the Beatitudes then come as really not necessarily a parallel for the Decalogue, but a reinterpretation of the kingdom of God. And so, although he gets into the law when it deals with some of the things that in after the Beatitudes, although he gets into the connection to the law, the Beatitudes themselves really should be seen as like a promise for those who were downtrodden, and that there was something on the other side, that their earthly suffering was valued was worthwhile for something. Right. And then you get into a reinterpretation of the commandments in the sections that follow after that we read today. Was that, Jim?
It's a guideline or a guide to how to live your life.
The 10 Commandments?
No, the Beatitudes.
Oh, the Beatitudes.
It's a guide.
It is. And the question always is, I think sometimes we look at it and we think, oh, this is somewhat for the downtrodden. But I think trying to compartmentalize it for who was regardless of who the audience was, its applicability is about us being disciples and ushering in God's kingdom, not about necessarily, the question should never be, am I the one Jesus is speaking to? The question should be, do I fit these categories? And some of those things are realized now and some of them aren't. How many of us are suffering for righteousness' sake?
Yeah, and I was thinking maybe the separation of, or the singling out of the disciples had to do with the fact that we just talked for a few chapters about Jesus's call of the disciples. So the crowd's all sitting together, but some of them have heard this specific call and renounced everything else. And so how are they going to hear what Jesus said, maybe on a deeper level? And that's hopefully us.
No, yeah. Were you going to say something? I felt like you were about to say something.
Yeah, I was, but I don't think I should.
You should.
No.
If you're resisting saying, I really think you should.
Well, I can't figure out why he's writing this book. He's taking what's in the Bible. Is it what he feels about it, or is he trying to Well, as I told Kim yesterday, while we were driving and I'm listening, I said, I feel like I could just read the Bible and I'd get what he said.
Yeah.
So why is he putting it in a book? I mean, I know you don't know, but
I mean, I'm sure there probably are people who have suspicions about why he put these things in. And I think because when you look at the gospel, the pure, like hardcore gospel and what Jesus taught, there's a lot of teachings and parables and things around. The Beatitudes and the Sermon on the Mount are sort of considered by most in the theological world as like the high point of his teaching, like the crux of his teaching. Yeah, the
was he
core.
writing this book at the time? Or was this after Hitler's downfall? Or was he writing?
No, this is before. So he was,
So
yeah.
to try to get the followers that they're trying to get together,
So
stand up.
So yeah, we go and so at this point there would have probably, and I'm not a World War II expert, but I believe at this point the Jews would have been arrested and taken to concentration camps, and he is in Finkelwald at the seminary, and I don't know, was it a dozen guys or 16? So he's got a dozen or so young men who he's trying to disciple. And he also is witnessing a state church. And in Germany, you have to understand, we have that in a weird way, because I think sometimes we are a Christian nation, but not in the same way that Europe was a Christian nation. Europe was a Christian nation just because everyone claimed to be Lutheran or Christian or something, because that's if you want to be buried or married or anything, anything you wanted, any sort of, and so it was just sort of a given as a part of citizenship. And so when he's looking at this church, and that's what he's in the visible church, when he's looking at the church and he's saying, how can we know that the Jews are God's chosen people? It's it's one of the foundational beliefs of our own, expression of faith. And when we know that this is happening to them and all we're doing is standing by and watching, that is motivating him to bring this fervor.
What they need to do.
It is, well, because at that point, honestly, if we were in that place now and our government was operating in a genocidal way, we were just rounding up, Middle Easterns and just sticking them in concentration camps, the church will be at that same place too. We'd be saying, like, this is not what we're called to. And you would see a lot of those voices that are probably pretty subdued ordinarily rise up in a prophetic way. And then in the midst of those who rose up in a prophetic way, there would also be the question of how can those who have platforms already not speak into this? Well, they're only concerned really about their own flourishing, not about the what it means to be a disciple and our call to alleviate this sort of atrocity. So and that's what I'm saying. The whole thing has to be understood
in a different context.
Yeah, and even the Beatitudes and the Sermon on the Mount were written to Jews, who had a very different mindset than we do in the 21st century. And so when we interpret these as literal sort of just words and just read them, and goes back a few weeks ago, the sermon I preached, like the level of misinterpretations and sloppy interpretations that happen in our culture are vast, far too vast. And that's one of the challenges of the individualization of spirituality. Instead of a sacred canopy, we're all walking around with our own little sacred umbrellas, thinking, we declare truth to be truth because we experience it as truth. Which I would say is at the heart, at the heart of liberal theology, not liberal conservative politics or anything today, but what we call liberal theology, the idea that we are starting from the liberty of the human being to interpret the world. And there's a lot of challenges in that.
And it seems to me like he was, aside from the mistreatment of the Jews, that he is trying to call people out of apathy.
Yeah.
And that's not unlike where a lot of our churches are today. Like,
absolutely,
we're apathetic and we're like, and it's easy to take Jesus's words and water them down instead of wrestle with them. We what Jesus said to the rich young ruler, we're like, and I think Bonhoeffer kind of was saying this, like, we kind of like, okay, let's put that in a neat package and we can set it over here. And we don't have to truly deal with what is Jesus calling me to do.
Yeah.
And like, so what do these words of Jesus really mean? well, if we live in an age of apathy and in a church of apathy, it's easy to just say, oh, I think that was, let's package that up and set it over here. And we can take Jesus's words and twist them to mean anything we want them to.
Yeah.
And that sounds like what he was fighting. And do I agree with everything he says? No, not necessarily, but I see that he's trying to wrestle with the actual content of what Jesus said.
Yeah. Can you all hear him?
Yes.
No, yeah, I think you're spot on. So, I was gonna say something else, but then it'll come back to me. What else in the Beatitudes?
One section that really stood out to me was on page 112. I guess I'm going to read a whole paragraph because I made a little note like, oh, this is a good section, and then I was like, oh, this is a good section. Blessed are the poor in heart, for they shall see God. Who is pure in heart? Only those who have surrendered their hearts completely to Jesus, that he may reign in them alone. Only those whose hearts are undefiled by their own evil and by their own virtues too. The pure in heart have a childlike simplicity like Adam before the fall, innocent alike of good and evil. Their hearts are not ruled by their conscience, but by the will of Jesus. If men renounce their own good, if in penitence they have renounced their own hearts, if they rely solely upon Jesus, then his word purifies their hearts. Purity of heart is here contrasted with all outward purity, even the purity of high intentions. The pure heart is pure like of good and evil. It belongs exclusively to Christ and looks only to him who goes on before. Only they will see God, who in this life have looked solely upon Jesus Christ, the Son of God. For their hearts are free from all defiling fantasies and are not distracted by conflicting desires and intentions. They are wholly absorbed by the contemplation of God. They shall see God, whose hearts have become a reflection of the image of Jesus Christ. And that section where he says, only those who are undefiled by their own evil and by their own virtues too. I think to me that really summed up like some of the like upside down kingdom that Jesus brought. Like Jesus didn't come to just rescue people from their evil, from their sin. He came to rescue the Pharisees from their righteousness.
Yeah.
And I see this in my own life where I need to be rescued from my virtues, which is actually some kind of self-righteousness.
Yeah.
And it's only in Jesus that we have this blessing.
And it comes down to that sense of, again, and I feel like I'm a person, I feel like I'm beating the same drum all the time. The idea that our earthliness is worthless. I mean, this is a temporal period. Even the emotions we feel, the connections we have, we know this. There's testimony in the scripture to it. So in a sense of denying oneself, whether it's by virtues or by vice, it's a reassignment or a readjustment of how we view our life. Although I struggle, it's funny, I read of all of them, I struggled with this one the most. And I feel like he did, and honestly, I kind of felt like he did too, because he doesn't write, it's a very short section. He sets an ideal that feels impossible. I mean, like, if you're talking about Adam before the fall and we're post fall, there's no way I can regain that innocence. And the purity of my heart is never going to be there. My heart has always been pure. So just the idea of that, and which is odd for a Lutheran, no doubt, because Lutherans don't really believe in that sense of perfectionism in the same way that some other holiness movements might. But no, I like that section. I just struggled with. I thought it was a little unreadable. That's always been the beatitude I've never really cared for. because I don't see any human being in that condition. You can be meek, you can mourn, you can be persecuted for righteousness' sake, but the pure in heart.
Well, but we're taking on Christ's purity. It's not our own purity. We can't be pure. And I will say that throughout all this stuff I read, I wrestle with Bonhoeffer's like stark, like very stark lines. And it does seem like at times he's saying like it's this way and almost like there's no grace.
Yeah.
Is what it feels like. But I don't think that's how, I think he's purposely like drawing stark lines, but I think maybe he's understanding that the reader can discern what he means.
Yeah. Well, and he,
Because we can't be like Adam before the fall. That's not possible.
Can't go back.
and he also had, I mean, obviously this was worked out and taught in very different ways than it was written, but I mean,
And it was written in German.
it was written in German.
Jason,
Yes.
I have a question about that. The blessed are they that mourn? Because
Yes.
he interpreted that in a very different way from what I've always thought that it meant. I thought it meant a literal mourning, those who are grieving for whatever loss of some kind, loss of a person or something of value. And he calls it, he means doing without what the world calls peace and prosperity. And I'd like to think that it meant when Jesus said it, that he was sensitive to people who were grieving, just as he was when Mary and Martha were grieving their brother's death, or, you know, I think that God grieves with us when we grieve.
Yeah, and honestly, like my interpretation, Jason speaking of blessed are they that mourn, are the sense of those who have sorrow, those who do mourn. And I think what he's trying to, and maybe this is just too small of an example, when he goes on to 109, he says the disciple community does not shake off sorrow as though we're no concern of its own, but willingly bears it. And a simple way down, another sentence down, it says they simply bear the suffering which comes their way as they try to follow Christ and bear it for his sake. And so I think that there is a sense of we're bearing sorrow, but we're bearing it differently. And because when it all sort of comes home at that last sentence before it goes on to the meek, it says, thus do they find their true home with the crucified Lord, both here and eternity. In other words, there's a sense of, again, that readjustment of we are eternal beings and we're living in this world, and we're living it in a way that we bear the sufferings which come from mourning, but we bear them differently. Anything else? I struggle with the next section in the meek. It says, when the community of blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. This community of strangers possesses no inherent right of its own to protect its members in the world, nor do they claim such rights, for they are meek. They renounce every right of their own and live for the sake of Jesus Christ. So, in other words, like the idea that you're so meek that that harm would still happen. When reproached, they hold their peace, and this is he's talking about the disciple community. When treated with violence, they endure it patiently. When men drive them from their presence, they yield their ground. They do not go to the law to defend their rights or make a scene when they suffer injustice, nor do they insist on their legal rights. They are determined to leave their rights to God alone. And then it's in Latin.
That's an interesting statement whenever you consider that he was on the assassination plot.
Who? Well, that's what I'm saying. I mean, there's a sense of no, and this, but he would differentiate it, because he said he would say he wasn't defending himself, he was defending others for the sake of. So he saw himself as he was taking on the burden of murder for the sake of others. But I find, like, that's hard. That's a hard pill to swallow. And this goes back to that, if this earth doesn't matter, But quite frankly, in a pretty heavily gun-toting church, that usually we would respond to people's sentiments of, if someone came into your house, what would you do? Well, I'd shoot first and ask questions later. This really presses that maxim of what that means, because if we are truly just temporal in our place, then that moment where we pull that trigger is, and where we may take someone's life, are we doing that in our discipleship? Are we doing that in the fear of the anxious human condition that we find ourselves in?
Jason,
Yeah.
sorry, just one more thought. If this group has not seen the movie called Women Talking, I highly recommend it, because it is the story of a community, a Christian community, an Amish community, that struggles with an injustice and really has to work through how they respond. And they have various options they consider. One would be that total meekness, just accept it and don't fight it. And it's a very interesting study of
What's it called?
Women Talking. It has just really powerful
So on Netflix?
religious themes. You could probably get it on that. We saw it in the theater.
Probably on demand.
But I'd love to discuss that with people, because it's the study of a community coming to terms with an injustice and how to forgive and how to deal with that injustice. And it would be a valuable study that we should watch together and talk about.
Absolutely. Maybe the summer do that.
Yeah.
No, as you're saying, that reminds me, when as many of you know, I was in the Tizay community. My first night there was the night Brother Roger was violently murdered in the church 30 feet from me. His knife came out and the woman slit his throat. Romanian woman who was mentally unstable. But the next day at 10 o'clock, the brothers met with the adult community that were there, and they met with the youth too in different communities. But the brother Wolfgang came and he sat down and he said a number of things. One, he said, we forgive her. And two, we said they wanted to make a particular embrace of the Romanians that were there, who were ashamed of their fellow country person, and said, we want to embrace you. And they invited them, in deeper into the community. And the brothers still go visit the woman who murdered their founder and leader of their community in prison. But it was in part and I was there for 2 weeks after that, but it was in part watching their response towards someone who just killed their leader. That, like I said, that is a perfect example of what happens in times of trauma and how churches respond. And when churches and faith, not even churches, I would say when faith communities, we are called to respond differently to all sorts of stuff. And when the world sees us responding differently, it means we're embodying those things that we believe. And you want to talk about it, all of the attractiveness of anything that a church could ever have, authenticity and living out one's ideals couldn't be less attractive to people, because I think that's what people want. They want something real. They want something that means something. So,
Jason, if he was somehow rationalizing, though, the fact that he was going to be a part of a group that was going to murder Hitler, and he was rationalizing that, though, back to your point, though, if somebody's breaking in your house and you shoot them, yeah, you could use the rationalization argument, though, that you've got a family to protect. And you get into that same kind of thinking, I think, when you get into if you can rationalize murdering Hitler. Of course, it's on a much larger scale that he's killing people. But what would the Tizay community do if they would have had a chance to prevent him? Somebody could have put an arrow in him, say, or that woman, before she slit the fellow's throat. Would have they done that?
I don't think so.
They'll let her kill him.
They would have probably, if they don't, would have not let her in the prayer service. But not at the cost of force or violence.
So
So-
they could have, if they saw her pull a knife, put it to his throat and they had it, but they would have done it. Or
They probably would have grabbed her, but if one of them had a gun, or had access to a knife, would they have stabbed her in return? Probably not. But these are also people who have made life commitments to living a life of prayer, and I mean, like everything about them. I mean, and they've been well. I mean, that's the thing is, they live life differently, and I think that and Bonhoeffer in those earlier chapters acknowledged that there are monastic communities where these people who are taking this extreme form of discipleship, but that's not the norm. This has been, I've had a fascination with monasticism most of my adult life, and I've studied it and written, book about a monastic community with the intent of understanding what's going on, and trying to bring some of those monastic commitments and ideals and spirituality into our common day life, because there's a lot of value there, but the adherence that they have towards that sort of life is just something that is really almost impossible for people to live in. So when our newest expressions of monasticism are usually intentional Christian community, which I'm of the contention that we in Lake City could live a more monastic lifestyle in the way we intersect with one another, and not in the sense of, solemnness as much as our emphasis on community and connection, and in a more of an intentional communal way. So,
Somewhere in one of these chapters, he says something about like, if we want an exception to this, then everybody could have an exception, because everybody is a father protecting their children, or a pastor protecting his flock. And I don't remember where that.
I think that's in the revenge chapter, if I
where
recall.
was that, but
Well, before we get to that, and I want to let's go to this visible community. Anything in that we'll go through. This is the salt and the light. I personally prefer my interpretation to it. Joan, what were you going to say?
I just like the distinction that he made on both the salt and light section, just saying, it's not, he's commanding us, we must be, or we have it, but we are salt and we are light. I like that distinction that he made.
You mean we don't have a choice? If we're followers, disciples, that's just the role we get.
Right. And it says at the bottom of 117, now they must be what they really are. Otherwise, they're not followers of Jesus. So it's not that we have it, or we should attain that, or we should strive for that. We are salt and we are light. And I like that distinction that he made.
Yeah.
In the middle of 117, he says, and since you are that light, you can no longer remain hidden, even if you want to. And I was like, whoa, yeah, that's pretty cool.
And I think, keep in mind, he's speaking, he is writing this probably in his mindset. I mean, I can feel his like sort of prophetic angst. He's writing this to the other mamby-pamby Christians in the real Lutheran church, in the state church, who are doing nothing.
Yeah.
He's saying, you're light. If you're claiming to be a disciple of Christ, you have a job to be the salt and the light. And if you're not, that's why, I mean, when he comes down and he's like, otherwise they are not followers of Jesus. Well, he's drawing a line in the sand, but he's doing it at a time where maybe it needed to be drawn in the sand. So
Actually, Jason,
yeah, go for it, Denny.
okay, I see what he's saying, because if you think about it, very few people actually knew at the time about Jesus Christ. If it wasn't for the disciples, the word really would have not gotten out. If it wasn't for the fact that they did spread out and spread the word, it would have died.
Absolutely. And honestly, that's part of our calling, is the sense of, but here's the thing is, we're not called to save. We're not called to transform. We're called to proclaim, and we're called to love. And that's a softer 21st century interpretation of it. But when you're in his situation, the call to discipleship has far more, challenging standards.
Jason?
Yeah.
Talk about kind of stark lines. On page 117, that continuation of the first paragraph, last sentence, it says, the call of Jesus Christ means either that we are the salt of the earth, or else we are annihilated. Either we follow the call or we are crushed beneath it. And I underline this, there's no question of a second chance. So it's like, you either do it there isn't a second chance. Am I not interpreting that?
No, I think you're right. And again, that's the extreme nature of it. And I would say
It's just like, you
We-
don't get a second chance.
we have a more gracious view of God in our culture and in our understanding. And I would hope that, I mean, part of me hopes that that's more representative view of God. And I don't think that means we have to disregard what he's saying, but the truth is Christ was drawing a pretty hard line in the sand. And if we really took Christ at his words in scripture, we have a lot to reflect on because, we all live pretty cushy lives.
Well, in a way, there's no question of a second chance, but the calling of Jesus is a second chance.
After that second chance, though.
Well, if we deny the call of Jesus, then I don't think there's another chance. And Judas Iscariot, he fell in the ranks. He was hoping to see the overthrow of the government. He was hoping to be holding the purse when the new kingdom was established. And he was crushed beneath the calling. He was called and he was crushed. And so I think you don't understand it as like this is our first chance, but this is our, who knows how many chances the Lord has given us at this point.
Yeah.
But it could be our last.
That's true.
And in that environment, that was, very true. By standing up, you actually could put yourself in a place where, you might lose your life. And that's why he places this extreme, like we're called to die. And and I can preach that from the pulpit, we're called to die, but that really doesn't mean much, there's no like, okay, that sounds good. Okay, anything else for 7? If not, we can move on to 8. Anything? On the bottom of 122 and the top of 123, I enjoyed the line, there is no fulfillment of the law apart from communion with God, and no communion with God apart from fulfillment of the law. Which is interesting because it means that sense of, your communion with God is dependent on the actions of fulfilling the law, but yet we're not saved by virtue. This isn't the nature of salvific matter. It is, but that sense of fulfillment and our communion, what it means. So can you commune with God if you're not fulfilling the law, if you're not living in that space? But to forget the first condition, meaning there's no fulfillment of the law apart with communion, is a mistake of the Jews, and forget the second, the temptation of the disciples, the idea that no communion with God apart from the fulfillment of the law. So they can't abandon it. They can't just get rid of it. And I think that calls upon all of us. The challenge we have as we live in, this time, again, the extreme nature of it. And he's drawing from Lutheran theology, which was developed at a time where there was a break from the Western church. So there's this idea that the law was confining. And so from the Reformation on, from the 1600s on, 1500s, 1600s on, it was the question of what does biblical ethics look like? What is the morality of people? How is that defined? Is it defined by the church? Is it defined by the state? Is it defined by the individual? And that's where we are now. It's defined by the individual. So, in other words, fulfillment law is different for everyone, unfortunately.
Jason?
Yeah, Denny.
I got a little bit confused on this part here. Isn't it that the Jews think the reason they have trouble with Jesus Christ is because he kind of puts himself above the law in their mind? Am I mistaking the way that they're thinking?
They think that Jesus sees himself as above and outside the law, and that's the blasphemy charge, because only God is above and outside the law.
That's what that was.
God.
And that seems to be the problem, is that he's agreeing with the law, but he's saying that, yeah, there's a law, but you have to go through me or it doesn't work.
Yes. And ultimately, I mean, that's what Jesus is making. This chapter is about the fact that the fulfillment of the law comes through Jesus, and that relationship with Jesus, he becomes the median or the conduit through which the law is fulfilled and the communion is happening with God. No one comes to the Father but by Christ. That notion. So.
And with that statement, you can see why the people of the time who didn't know of all this before him would have a little bit of a problem. Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, we're a pretty established religion, 2,000 years old. How do you think in the last century or so that we've felt about the Mormons? They're taking a good part of our scripture. They add a little bit of their own. Sounds like a story we're familiar with. I mean, is that what we Jews? We took their scriptures, added some of our own, and said we're the right ones. I mean,
what's the difference?
Though. I wish we had some special underwear in our.
No, I got it right down.
Right fast.
All right. But no, the righteousness of Christ is, and again, and I think the challenge of this chapter is he's covering everything with the righteousness of Christ in relationship to the law is a theological doctrine for the Jews. And that's why I mean it's important to think about Matthew as a book written for a Jewish audience, is because we have never been under that law. So, and the law that we have been given, as we're about to unfold in the next few, is actually a higher law because it is meant to tap into the intention of what's behind that, of loving one's neighbor and oneself, the denial of oneself versus just the outward appearance of doing that for the sake of legalism or righteousness. So let's with that turn to chapter 9, the brother, or I think that would be, I think that he's using the language of Matthew. But obviously that would include sisters as well. But then in some cases it doesn't. I think he kind of goes back and forth. So just keep that in mind. He does not mean, however, the neighbor, as he clearly makes. And I think this is also a seed, kind of like, hey, some of these laws apply to us as brothers and sisters of Christ, but Hitler was not a brother in this schema. So it's just one more seed of saying something is outside of this maxim he's trying to create around the idea of not having anger or wrath or murdering your brother. So basically the section in the passage, and he gives those right above, Matthew 21 through 26, that if you have anger against your brother, that you are already in a place of a murderous spirit. So, which I'm guilty of. And actually just a personal, no, and it's in all seriousness, when I was fired from that job in Seattle, I went into the darkest time I've ever experienced in my life. And I share this openly and somewhat ashamedly. I remember a time, and it was really a point, I remember a time where I felt such malice, I would fantasize about his daughter getting hit by a car or a bus. I did at one point, so that he would experience the pain that I was experiencing in my life. And it was at that, and the reason I share that is it was at that realization, there was a moment in the consciousness of my own malice, like I was wishing ill or hurt or harm to someone else so that someone else would experience some extra. I know Carrie's looking at me like a monster. And we hired him as our pastor. I'm just kidding. No, you were looking at me like a monster. But it was at that point that I realized, like, it was such a dark place for me. And I would say this is exactly like, for me to experience that sense of animosity, that sense of malice, that sense of anger towards another human being, and to wish them pain, was I knew something in the depth of me that wasn't right. So that ultimately, I ended up going to Zay for a week or so after that, just to kind of get my head on straight. And then I wasn't right on the right path. I wasn't in the right head, but I was on the right path after that. That helped me. But what's that?
Get a spiritual cleanse.
I was a little spiritual cleanse, a little,
Yeah. Yeah, I'm by the anger section because, it's not just that's in my nature. My dad was German, and I feel like I've got his hot-headed German side, but that it's, you know, that it's an offense against God. And that kind of struck me. And that I like in the middle of 127, where, you know, every life is precious and that God alone has power over life and death. And so again, in talking about his plot to kill Hitler, you know, it's just that whole, you know, God could have taken Hitler out himself, but he didn't. And so I, you know, that just struck me as that human desire to take care of something themselves.
Well, and I think that's why the notion that he says it's an anger is an attack on the brother's life. So he is
Mhm.
trying to, I don't know. Again, I'm no Bonhoeffer scholar, so I'm just sort of interjecting my own hermeneutic of suspicion. But when I hear that, and there's somewhere in here he nuanced what a brother was. But that sense just that he's trying to there's just that seed of there's exceptions to everything.
Jason,
Yeah.
just one thing that struck me in the righteousness of Christ is, it's page 122 in my book, when my pages aren't the same as yours. But he says, now we can see why up to now, Jesus has said nothing about himself in the Sermon on the Mount. And it's like he's trying to make sure that we understand that everything he's saying, that Jesus is saying, Jesus doesn't talk about himself. He talks about how his disciples are supposed to live, but they can only do that through him.
Right.
I think that's the point, the main point Bonhoeffer's trying to make here, isn't he? That Jesus didn't make himself.
No, and for Bonhoeffer and many Lutherans, everything is oriented around the cross and what Christ did on the cross. So Christ is always the mediator. Yeah.
But since the Sermon on the Mount was before that, before the cross, Jesus didn't himself tell them that it was through him.
I mean, I think he did in other places and other words, but not necessarily in this, because, and this is one actually one of the debated questions. Who was the audience? We talked about earlier. He was kind of speaking to everyone, but really, you know, but was he speaking to his disciples? Was he speaking to those that poor in spirit? Was he speaking to those who were, and it's a universal call, but it kind of is, I guess, a summary of the gospel is what, you know, most people consider it. So regardless of who he's speaking to, there's applicability on all fronts.
Jason, following up on what Linda said, at the top of 127, it says, only those who apprehend the law of the word of Christ are in a position to fulfill it. And then he goes on this, and I like this statement. Christian was talking about the Pharisees earlier. The heresy of the Pharisees must be excluded at all cost.
Yeah.
Top of 127.
Yeah.
Only by knowing Christ as giver and fulfiller of the law can we attain the true knowledge of the law.
Yeah. And I actually, I mean, I would go down even farther at the bottom. He declares war on all false interpretation of it. And by honoring it, he gives himself into the hands of its false devotees. Again, and this is the challenge that I have with all of this is Bonhoeffer interpreting this for a bunch of German Gentiles when this was written in the context of the law for Jews. But I think what he's trying to ultimately say, if he has, every book is written with a opponent, or I mean, every book that's theologically written is usually written with someone in mind that you're addressing to. You're trying to combat something. And when I read that, it makes me think he's trying to combat those churches or those Christians or those leaders who are claiming their righteousness by the law or by the fact that they have just, and he's digging deeper down into that commandment, that there's an intentionality there, that there's, but that always comes through Christ. And that's going to be a tack on for almost everything in this book.
Well, and Jason, and this might be, I don't know, I kind of fall like somebody else did. Yeah, I don't know if I want to say it, but looking at the way he's write this and thinking about something, would it have been different? Knowing his history, Bonhoeffer came from a aristocratic cushy life. He had everything he ever needed. He had all the money he needed. He could do anything, education. And then the Germans took over. And then he went against the Germans. If none of that would have happened, would have he still done and wrote the way he did? Or is this,
No,
is he using this?
I would say no. What's that?
Probably not.
I mean, I would say no, just by virtue of that's just we write out of the things that happen to us and the passions that are there, and not and you could, but my guess is he would, if you would have given Bonhoeffer, if there was no World War II and you had given Bonhoeffer as a theologian who went through his studies in the rich bougie family that he was in, and with all his privilege and everything that comes in, and you said, hey, write on the 10 or write on the Beatitudes or the Sermon on the Mount, I think that you would get the same theological interpretation with a lot less polemical, like on the edge language, because I think that what he's pointing to is not really that unique. You read any missiologist, you read any, you read most theologians who deal with this and deal with this as a matter of fact of how, yeah, I mean, I think the only difference is that I probably preached when I preached it, that we serve a God of grace and all of this, as I recall. This was that sermon that I thought that everyone was going to walk out on, because I'm hitting all these tough issues. but from our 21st century perspective, there's a God of grace in all of this. You're a disciple, you're called to be discipleship, but God also recognizes that we're messed up and we're going to make mistakes and we're going to fail along the way. Where what Bonhoeffer ironically is doing is not dispensing grace, but grace is, even though he's dispensing enough cheap grace to push everyone off to the side who doesn't really want to be a disciple, but he's calling people to costly grace because there are costly things happening. So,
Well, and when I think about the context and who Jesus was speaking to, it makes sense that Jesus, in a lot of these things, he's just saying, this is what has been said. This is what you've heard. And Jesus is saying, it goes deeper. It goes deeper than the ceremonial washing of your hand and you check that box and you can move on. It goes deeper than, like, make sure you don't murder your brother. Like, it's murder in your heart. And like the example you gave is, anger can be murder, like in our hearts. It really can, and it goes there much more quickly than we think. So when I think of the historical context, it's Jesus calling the people that he was speaking to like a higher, deeper truth, not just something where they can go through the laws and check the box and be like, yep, I've done all of these. And that's the same with the rich young ruler. He's like, this is what you're supposed to do. And the guy's like, I've done it. And he had compassion on him and called him so far beyond all of that. But when I think of God's word, the words of Jesus reaching German disciples or us now, like taken out, like not fully understanding the context of who it was written to, like the words of Jesus still call to us, and they push away the people that are not followers, and it drags in the people that are, but in a mysterious kind of way. Like, what does Jesus mean? Like, I've got to read this again and again and again and try to, I'm wrestling with the Beatitudes, and I've been wrestling with them for on and off for 25 years.
And you probably will for the rest of your life. Let's closing out this chapter. I want to read two quick sentences. 129, first full paragraph at the end of it. The incarnation is the ultimate reason why the service of God cannot be divorced from the service of man. He who says he loves God and hates his brother is a liar. And I think that is the heart of the brother chapter, that we can't call ourselves disciples if we aren't of the disposition of the emptying of oneself for the sake of the other. because following Christ means following what he did. And he emptied himself in the incarnation, came and then gave himself as a sacrifice. And then you come to the very end of the chapter to serve our brother, to please him, to allow him to do his due and to let him live is a way of self-denial, a way of the cross. Greater love hath no man than this, that a man laid down his life for his friends. Again, maybe a little hint towards what he was about to do. This is the love of the crucified. Only in the cross of Christ do we find the fulfillment of the law. And essentially, he's speaking to those German authorities or those German states leaders who, church leaders who felt like they were in keeping. And this is where we get in, and we'll get into the section about violence, why he provides a little bit of provision in that as well. Let's turn to 10, woman. I really don't like his, I think that's probably not the greatest title for the chapter. He could have come up, he should have workshopped that a little more. It just starts off with a little defensive tone, in particular in our culture. But let's turn to the woman chapter and see what's going on there. So what stood out to you?
He wouldn't approve of Jim and my being married.
No, he might not have, he probably wouldn't have minded. You're both good people.
Speak for yourself.
They're all laughing here.
I heard Snickers.
It's more snickering than laughing. No, in short, I think he kind of cuts this a little short, in part because, he kind of just, not that he glosses over it, but he deals with it because he has to, because it's in the text, but it's not his agenda. He does talk about, I thought there's some interesting things just about the idea of celibacy versus being married. On page 132, it says Jesus does not impose intolerable restrictions on his disciples. He does not forbid them to look at anything, but bids them to look on him. And just echoing sentiments from the last chapter, it's kind of like the world itself is not evil. Right. But the way we conceptualize, the way we envision the world can have an evil tinge or lens to it. But when we look at things through Christ, and we look at Christ and we look at the world through Christ, then we see it differently. I was a teaching fellow for a class on reconciliation and forgiveness. And one of the things that just has always stood with me is an interpretation of how we go. Humans don't forgive and forget. We forgive and then we remember, and then we forgive again, and then we remember, and then we forgive again. Because forgiveness is always that divine attribute of God giving us a sense of forgiveness in ourselves. So we have to constantly return to the source. If we try to do it ourselves, we can't. But what a guy named Miroslav Volf, a theologian out of Yale, evangelical, he's really changed the way I viewed it in terms of how do we look back on an instance and not remember the hurt and the pain and the emotions. So think of it, I don't really think, but imagine a trauma in your life that every single time something triggers it triggers all the emotion and the drama and the challenges that comes to it. And I even look at my own life. I was able to reconcile with those pastors and Mercy Press who fired me so violently. And it took 4.5 years till I met with them. But it was only through looking back through the lens of Christ at the entire, ordeal that happened that I started to see God's grace for me and my mistakes and my shortcomings, that I was able to extend grace to God, the grace of God for their mistakes and shortcomings, acknowledging that no one did it perfectly. And Wolf talks about how only by looking through Christ's lens at things that have happened in our lives can we actually reframe them or re-understand them. So I think that's pretty powerful, that idea that we look on Christ and look through Christ's eyes, as opposed to the world's eyes, that we can find reconciliation and avoid an objectification of the world. Anything else on that? You all want to get to the truthfulness chapter. You all have told some lies in your lives.
I'd like to know what Al thinks about that, because he dealt with oaths, and there's a lot about oaths here, and he must have dealt with that in legal context.
Well, I think from a legal context, you take an oath, and like I said earlier, it's unfortunate the Bible wasn't left into that, but given the fact that there's so many different cultures and different religions and whatnot, it didn't mean anything. And people, I find, violate those oaths more than you would believe. They take an oath and then they get cross-examined and they're proven to be a liar.
Yeah.
And it happens more times than not. It's all very self-serving for that reason. And there are very few, I think, people that don't shade the truth to have stories come out the way they want it. And from that standpoint, that's why you kind of remind them, well, you don't kind of, you do remind them that they're under oath, and for failure to do that, they can be charged with perjury. And if they do that, there are consequences for it. And that's the way you enforce it. But I don't think a lot of them take it really seriously. I really don't.
No,
It's kind of a
Why would you?
formality. I'm going to sit down and I'm going to tell you what I want, and then let the other guy have his shot at it. You get to figure out who's telling the truth.
but there has to be appeal to a larger ethic in order to have that oath mean anything. And that's why the Bible was originally there, because it's like you're not making an oath just before the judge in the court. You're making an oath before the divine being, which organizes and frames it. So if it, what I hate about it is it's kind of like there's a standard where you can't lie. Like we had to create a standard that said you can be a liar every other part of your day, but when it comes to this point, now the lying has to stop.
Well, and if you think about it in a different way too, they create machines that are supposed to be able to tell whether you're lying or not. So, lie detectors always came into play. But one of the things about that, many conversations I had with FBI folks who were trained and given lie detectors, you go through and you have to figure out how you phrase your question. Because if you ask them, did you steal the money? In their mind, I was owed the money.
Yeah.
I didn't steal it. I took what was mine. So when they answer it, it'll come across as clean as a whistle.
Yeah.
So you have to go, well, do you know where the money is? And then eventually, if you ask the right questions, they'll start to fidget around, but it's all how it gets worded, I guess.
I think where Bonhoeffer goes off a little bit on the rails is or just goes off track a little bit, is that he's not acknowledging why oaths were important at this time and period. And that's what makes this passage far more, everything was oral. Your word was, your word was your bond. There was not paperwork involved. There was no one gonna, if you said, I swear by this, then it was like, this was the ultimate contractual agreement. And, and if someone heard you say it, that was in there, and there was like an unspoken sort of, so he's not dealing with this. And I do like his twist on it that says oaths wouldn't be necessary if lies didn't exist, which is why I'm saying there's a standard of oaths that says this is where this little category of life is where lying can't happen. Yeah. With the assumption then that lies go on everywhere else. I had a friend who was a staff person at University Press who she gave up for Lent. She gave up lying. And it made me distrust. Yeah, I know. I forever have been fascinated by this, but Shannon and I both said ever since then, we don't know if we really fully trust her anymore. But she said, but from the small things like, you just make up some little, she said, we make up excuses for little things every day. Oh, I was late because, whatever, but we don't tell the traffic, but there was no traffic. Or, yeah, I'm going to get to you. I'll get back with you tomorrow, but we know very well we're not going to. Like there are little forms of deception that we engage in every single day life, some of us more than others. Just kidding.
To mind is, how are you? Oh, I'm fine.
Yeah, how are you? There's a deception.
That a lie? It's a deception.
Yeah, it is. If you're not going well,
Then you say, "Oh, I feel terrible." And you go, I'm sorry, I asked.
And then you're like, you violated the social contract, which says you just say good or okay. Those are the two only acceptable options.
Can I share a story? It won't take too long.
Yeah, go for it.
I had a small claims case, Whereas.
Are you allowed to share this story?
Yeah, this is all public record. All
Okay,
public record.
so I'll make sure. I wanna-
I had a small claims case where one of the ranchers down on the south end of the county was contacted by a fellow who booked a hunting trip. And they basically did it word of mouth. And the guy came up, shook his hand, said, okay, I'll have the other 3 guys up here, yada, yada, yada. Well, make a long story short, about 4 days before they were supposed to come, the guy called and canceled. And the rancher was trying to get back because he said to him, he says, you have to let me know at least 2 weeks in advance because I got to book the time. I'm going to lose a lot of money. And when it came to getting into things versus written contracts versus verbal contracts, I was left with no choice that I had to come down in favor of the guy who canceled. And when I went back and I asked him if they had anything to say at the end or any gripes or anything like that, the rancher from the south said, I've learned a lesson here. I was grown up that when you shook a man's hand, it was his word, and I'll never do it again. And watch crestfallen look he had on his face, like he had been just punched in the gut real bad. Everything he had been taught to believe in about telling the truth and doing the right thing just went right out the window.
Yeah.
That was horrible.
Yeah. And I don't know when that, probably sometime in the last century is where I would say that sense of your word is your bond or your handshake or spitting on your hand or whatever it was.
Yeah. Just a little note. I used to have breakfast with Al every Monday, and I had to be careful when he was judged what I was saying.
I hope you feel the same way around me. All right. Anything else?
They said you can convict someone by not making a note, by just abstaining.
Yeah.
You know, because you may know the answer to the question. You may know that the guy murdered him, he didn't murder him or whatever. And,
Yeah.
And by abstaining, you know, you either could convict or let the guy go.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the sin of omission, you know. Did you go to the store? No. I mean, not, you know, not yesterday. You didn't specify, you know, that's what I'm saying. Kind of go back to your point, you know, there's an inherent omission that one could, you know, just by not stating the truth, you sometimes aren't lying. But the spirit of deception is what lies underneath that. What is the intent? Is your intent to deceive or is your intent to bring out? And I think ultimately what he's saying is that as people of light, that the truth should always be what we seek to bring out.
And we shouldn't have to hedge it with an oath, like,
Yeah.
this time I'm serious.
This time.
Well,
we're
actually,
telling the truth.
that's actually funny.
And you said you're going to remove that big pile of dirt before the end of next month. So you all are witnesses to.
So, Judd Hollingsworth, it used to be when you would go get a bid from him or something as a contractor, he would be like, no, I'm not lying to you. I mean, it's, you know, OSB is $32 a sheet right now. I'm not lying to you. But he would say, I'm not lying to you enough that
That
you
you thought he
wait,
was.
could he be lying to me? Because he keeps saying this. And so with our truthfulness, like just saying the truth to
Yeah.
the best of our ability.
I often use the introductory phrase sentences both in writing and in speaking honestly. You know, I'm saying honestly. And Shannon always says that makes me seem dishonest. Like, what have you been saying? Oh, thus far, you know. I use it kind of like if truth be, you know, put out there, revealed. Truth be known. All right, we have 7 minutes, 7 holy minutes to look at revenge.
I just thought it was fascinating, the bottom of 141, when, you know, you think about, I'm trying to think what the passage was, but anyway, that resisting revenge is, it's not just passive or weakness, but it's in the face of evil or wrongdoing, it's so powerful because if it doesn't have anything to resist against, then it loses its power. And I thought it was a really powerful thing that he said.
Well, it is. It's kind of like if, you know, a military force attacking a group of monks and they're just standing there like, we're not going to do anything, you know, then it's what you almost take the argument or the effort out from underneath it.
Right.
I thought it was pretty profound. Go on.
It didn't stop Hitler. I mean, if people stood by and passively, like when the Jews were arrested and rounded up and people stood by passively, that didn't stop him. That didn't make him do any less. It took a long time before Hitler was, and it wasn't because of non-resistance that he quit.
No, and I think that, I mean, that probably, I mean, I think Hitler in all accounts is an extreme case for any social situation, but I think it's more like, I mean, if you want to put it on a daily level, like the bully who, you know, if you don't, they theory that if you don't, I know it doesn't really work, but theory that if you don't respond to a bully, that they'll go find someone else to bully. They're looking for the response, they're looking for the interaction. But I think that aside, what lies beneath this is still the idea of vengeance is not ours. We don't have to pay back. If someone slaps us, then it's like this, or there is that sense of total denial of self. The saying that Christ removes the church from the sphere of law, of politics and law, the church is not to be a national community like old Israel, but a community of believers without political or national ties. The old Israel had been both a chosen people and a national community, but it was therefore his will that they should meet force with force. But the church, it is different. It has abandoned political and national status, and therefore it must patiently endure aggression. Otherwise, evil will be heaped upon evil. Only thus can fellowship be established and maintained. Yet at this point, it becomes evident when a Christian meets with injustice, he no longer clings to his rights and defends them at all costs. He's absolutely free from possessions and bound to Christ alone.
So was he a pacifist?
I think theoretically he was, kind of in the same way I am, but if you attack me in an alley, I may change my tune.
He changed his tune and pointed the block to get Hitler.
But I honestly, I think that he changed his tune, and not that he didn't agree with pacifism, because I think that he saw it as he was, again, being the scapegoat or he was sacrificing his own, you know, I think he was probably hoping God is going to have enough grace to cover him, because everything that he does in that assassination plot, I think, goes very much against what some of his earlier thinking around ethics was.
But being a pacifist and standing by while other people, like if you make it first person in real time, like you're going down the street and you see that a child looks like they're being abducted or murdered by somebody. Is this saying we stand by and watch that? No way.
No.
But is it, if we have somebody who is attacking us, what do we do? What do we do with it? And I think the words of Jesus are meant to be wrestled with.
Yeah.
Like Paul took his case to the highest court he could in Rome. And you know, he did that with a clear conscience, as far as I know. But like, we're still called to turn the other cheek and put even our aggressors, our enemies, put their place in the kingdom, or their hopefully their redemption above our own needs.
And I do want to distinguish between the idea that you would defend yourself or even another brother and sister in Christ in the same way you might an innocent bystander. I think there's that ethic of giving of oneself for the sake of the other, which is what he was doing in the assassination plot. But at the end of the day, it really just comes down to the idea that we have to be prepared to give of our lives. So.
And I'd say the little bit I read about Bonhoeffer is he ended up going to the grave as a pacifist. It's not like his part in the assassination plot set him on a new course, and he was fighting when he got thrown in the concentration camp or the Gestapo prison. Like, he accepted it, and it seemed like he reached out to fellow prisoners and reached out to the guards. Like, he
lived out
still
what he
lived
said.
this out.
Yeah, no, he did, and I think he probably went to his death with full confidence. And I mean, like, this is a guy who believes what he's writing and he's living it out. Anything in the last chapter that of revenge that else you want to bring out? I did middle of page 142. By his willingly renouncing self-defense, the Christian affirms his absolute adherence to Jesus and his freedom from the tyranny of his own ego. 143, he's sort of addressing that, distinguishing between those who have special duty and those who don't, and he critiques the Reformed tradition. I think that comes into the relationship of calling and general calling as well, and sort of disabuses us of that notion that it's a calling that we all face.
And that is where that passage I was talking about earlier is, right in the middle of 143. Am I ever acting only as a private person or only in an official capacity? If I'm attacked, am I not at once the father of my children, the pastor of my flock, and a government official? So, and it seems like it's just something he's wrestling with to me, like, and I think it's got to come down to, like, in that moment, if there's an attacker knocking on your door, maybe pulling your gun and shooting is not the first thing you do. It's praying.
Or shoot him in the leg and then run.
And then pray.
Well, when it comes down to the circumstances.
Yes, I know. It's just, we hope no one ever gets into that circumstance. But at the end of that chapter, or the end of that paragraph that you're reading, Christian, it says, is it right to forget that the follower of Jesus is always utterly alone, always an individual who in last resort can only decide to act for himself? Don't we act most responsibly on behalf of those entrusted in our care if we act in this aloneness? And I think that that's his sense of, he somehow is justifying the act that he sees the swath of entrusted in his care is what he's called to do. So don't we still have to act in that?
On 144, it says, about 2/3 of the way down the page, and the cross is the only justification or the precept of nonviolence, for it alone handled a faith in victory over evil, which will enable men to obey that precept. So
That's a great quote to end on as well. And I think that a willingness to give up your life is sort of, when someone really believes something, like they're not just saying it was a principle or because it's an ideal or because it's an ideology that they have to participate in to be a good person in society. It's something that they believe truly to their core. I think the sense where we see nonviolence as a part of that, in that moment where violence could be appropriate or deemed justifiable, is seeing in that person, well, that person really believes. If someone's taking it, someone's abusing, I remember a time where my Filipino uncle, was berating my father because he married a white woman and he's got, mulatto kids, and we he diluted the Filipino line. But I remember sitting there, and we were in a hotel, and I was just around the corner, and he was yelling at him. My father just sat there and took it. And internally, I'm thinking to myself, why aren't you saying something? Why aren't you saying something? Why don't you defend yourself? But later in life, I reflected that back on, and I asked my father one day. I said, "Well, why didn't you use it?" And he said it wasn't needed. And so, but that for me was like he was enduring the abuse and beratement of his brother for the sake of his brother. So, all right. And on that note, we'll pray.
All right. Thank you.